All right, let's go ahead and get started here today. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 2023 year-end tips for BusinessWorks. And if you're not in the right spot, feel free to go ahead and take off. If you want to stick around, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we'll do to help ensure that we do clean processing at year's end or even really anytime during the year. To participate in the webinar, everyone should see a control box, if you will, and you can raise hand or you can chat your questions in the questions box. We've got a number of people in the presentation today, so we will probably not turn on audio for users. We'll work through the chat, and I'll try to answer questions as we go along. My name is Mary Hildinger, and I am a BusinessWorks software consultant with DWD Technology Group. I recognize a number of names here, and glad that you folks have come to visit with me here at this moment. Talk a little bit about DWD, who we are, for those of you who are not familiar with us. We will then go into some of the nitty-gritties with regards to BusinessWorks. How do we do our year-end backup? How long of history are we keeping? So on. We'll talk about closing modules. We'll talk about AP, AR, inventory, and GL year-end processing and reconciliation. And then for those of you who do use BusinessWorks Payroll, we will take a short break and we'll come back and we'll review some of the similar concepts with regards to payroll. For those of you who are not familiar with DWD Technology Group, we are a division of Dual Award and DeWald CPAs. We have a technology division that basically started rolling right around 1990. And we've got 3 primary office locations where we have both accounting staff and some technology staff. Of our staff of approximately 65 employees, almost half of us are in the technology group. We offer software and business consulting, and a lot of our expertise lies in manufacturing and distribution and accounting. What products do we offer? Sage 100 is one of the products that we offer. It is kind of like the bigger cousin to BusinessWorks. We also offer Sage Intacct, which happens to be Sage's cloud-based offering. Obviously, BusinessWorks. For those of you who may be familiar with Peachtree, that's what Sage 50 is now called. We do work with MIP Fund Accounting for not-for-profit organizations, Sage Fixed Assets, Sage Human Resource Management Software, and Sage CRM Contact Resource Management Software. Along with our software solutions, some of the services that we provide, we obviously will do training and support and setup. We'll help you with software upgrades. We can help you with custom report writing and data importing and exporting. Systems integration might be a little touchy with BusinessWorks because its capabilities to interact with third-party solutions is a little bit more limited. We do have a network, IT network team. Some of the like more core services that we offer happen along with our Sage 100 products. So some of the work order scanning and work order efficiencies and things like that. So if you think you might be outgrowing your BusinessWorks or you're not getting enough functionality, please come talk to us because we have some solutions that might be of use to you. Let's talk a little bit now about our point of being here today. It's getting close to year end. Most of us probably work on a calendar years. If we don't, certainly fiscal year. So whenever we hit our fiscal year end, we want to consider what are some proper steps to take. First thing that we want to consider is to take a look at how much history are we keeping. In each of our modules, we can specify a number of years or a number of months of history that we might want to keep. In the general ledger, we can keep up to 9 years worth of history. In accounts payable and accounts receivable, we're looking at, I believe, up to 60 months, which would be 5 years worth of history. When we think about how much history we're holding, we also think about doing our year-end backups or archiving our data. If we think about the amount of history that we keep in our software and we let that be a fairly large number, what can happen is that if we get too much history in there, we might start bogging things down. So lookups might take a little longer, reports might take a little bit longer, just some things that we want to be aware of and realize that in BusinessWorks, it is fairly easy to make a copy of the company, and we can retain that as an archive or an historical company that we don't transact in, but yet we can go back and see the details of various transactions. We can keep our live company cleaner, a little less cluttered, and it will help improve the performance of the software. Things that we do want to watch out for is with the length of history, that will trigger what kinds of things might get removed. Also, in our customer and vendor lists, once we start lapsing past the number of months that we're keeping history, some things that are not in use anymore, things that are not necessarily transacting, it will become possible to remove those customers or vendors or items if there's nothing outstanding. If we look at our customer master list as an example here, and I'll pull that up real quick just to show you what I'm talking about. In our maintained customers, you will see our trash can, and our trash can is not lit up, which means that I cannot delete that customer. And the reason is, A, there are transactions that are open, B, there might be there might be history that's out there. We have not elapsed our time of history that we're keeping, so we won't be able to get rid of that stale item in our list. How do we make a copy of our company? Probably the easiest way to do this is to make a backup of our data. You might be familiar with the file backup functionality, and we can go in and create our backup. Another option that we have, which actually is pretty quick and a little bit easier to manipulate, is under the utilities menu. We get into our utilities menu here, we can go to maintain companies, and we then will get a list of the companies in which we are working. And we can go ahead and say, well, you know what, I'm going to pick my company, and there's a button over here that is our copy company button. And we can go ahead and select that, and we can simply type in the new name of the company that we want to keep. We can choose whether or not we're going to copy the user security, and the goal would be to call it something that we know we're not going to get into. However many letters it will let us keep, and I know spaces can be ugly sometimes. Excuse me. I go ahead and I make the copy, and then BusinessWorks does a backup and restore right on the fly for us. So now I have my backup company, and I also have my original company or my live company in which I'll continue to work. So quick ways to be able to get a copy of the company. And the thing that we'll remember is that we will not do a period and close on that historical company. We're going to leave it as it is. So as we close our live company, then it will do its history limitations, and it will do the purging and the things that it needs to do so that we keep our live company fresh, but the historical company will always be there for us to review. In our Sage BusinessWorks, we have some options that are available to us, and these are located in the utilities menu at the top of the BusinessWorks menu. And that utilities menu at the very top of BusinessWorks is effectively the system manager functionality for the software. So we know that when we acquire BusinessWorks, we will have a system manager module, and then we'll have our various source modules, GLARAP, inventory, order entry, etc. The utilities menu at the very top of the software gives us overall software control. Whereas once we're in a company and we are accessing a specific module, the utilities menu for that module is related to exactly that company for exactly that module. When we look at the prior period posting functions, what we find is that BusinessWorks allows us to either post to a prior month, not post to a prior month, or post to a prior month for the current fiscal year only. And that's a setting that we might want to consider, because as we move forward into future periods, we don't necessarily want somebody to go back and to make a change to a prior fiscal year. You know, maybe they miskey a date or they do something. We don't want to give them the ability to let that happen. So we can block that by changing the prior month posting settings. And then we see a number of other settings that are there that we can enable or disable depending on what our preferences are. So keep that in mind if you want to ensure that nobody can affect a prior year. We probably want to choose no or current fiscal year only. We might allow certain people to have access to do that, but again, we would have to change this at a system level rather than on a company by company basis. So what's going on in BusinessWorks these days? Well, for those of you who have been keeping things upgraded, you will know that BusinessWorks came out with version 2023 earlier this year. The rule of thumb that Sage is doing as far as its support is that it will support the current and one prior version. So the supported versions from Sage Software are versions 2023 and 2021. There was no 2022, so we're not missing anything. That means if you call Sage and you are requesting support and they ask you what version you're on, and if you tell them something other than 21 or 23, they will guide you to upgrade first, because technically they will not support you. DWD, on the other hand, will try to support you, but if we get to a situation where we cannot help you, we know that the answer that we're going to receive from Sage is that you would need to upgrade. So if you're keeping current on your client care plan, that means you've got access to the software. It might be a matter of getting it installed. If you need that installed and you want some assistance with that, we can certainly help you. If you are running payroll, and you do not keep your software current, you will not be able to get the tax table updates at the end of the year. If you want to continue running the payroll, you would have to take the initiative to update those tax tables manually. Sometimes that is not pleasant. Sometimes there might be some subtle changes in the tax rules that the tax table updates can help accommodate. So it is a good idea to keep your versions current when at all possible. And as was just being discussed, keeping it updated. A lot of questions that I get, or a lot of comments that I get, why do I need to upgrade? I don't need anything new. It works. It's great. It's stable. Yes, it is a very, very stable product, and it does work very, very well. But because Sage's initiative to only support 2 versions at a time, we do want to consider keeping that updated. So again, just as another reminder, if you run into trouble, you get corrupted data for something that happened, a network outage or a computer outage or something that ruins your database, we may not be able to fix it for you. Sage definitely won't fix it for you unless you're running a current version. And again, just some more information. It's not always about the bells and the whistles, but it fixes issues in prior versions. Maybe those issues affected you, maybe not. The other thing is the operating systems of the computers that we're running on these days. We recognize that if Microsoft sets out a new operating system platform, BusinessWorks may not be compatible with that for the version on which you would be currently running. So they will do testing. Sage does testing as soon as new operating systems come out. They are not immediately compatible. So it might take a little bit of time before BusinessWorks issues an upgrade that would become compatible with the newer operating systems. But it's really, we kind of have to follow the flow of what the computers are that we are running. If we're running BusinessWorks Gold 4.0, for those of you who may remember that, that's a 20-year-old software package. And that worked really great on a Windows 95 computer, but who all's familiar with Windows 95? I have not seen that computer for a very long time, so we do have to keep ourselves updated as best we can. So let's talk about closing modules. And there are a multitude of ways to close the modules. We can do it module by module, of course, or we can use the company close function that is located in our utilities menu. And again, this utilities menu here at the top of BusinessWorks is related to the software or the company as a whole, whereas the utilities menu of a specific module is only for that module for that company. So if I go into my company close function, I get an option where I can pick and choose the different modules that I want to close, and I could potentially close multiple modules all at one time. The very first thing that shows up when we do a backup, or when we do the company close, is we get requested to make a backup. Some of us might be tempted to skip that backup. Oh, I never have any problems while I'm closing my companies. I'm not going to worry about it. And that will probably become the time that you have a computer hiccup or something happens and your data is in an unknown state. We can't fix that. Sage probably can't fix that. What we have to do is we have to rely on that backup that we made right before we started that closing process so we can get back to a known state and continue that particular function. When we get into our current month and we see where we are, we can see that our modules are in the current month of this particular test company is December of 22 with a December fiscal year end. And I could potentially close all of these modules all at the same time. We know that payroll we want to be a little careful of because we don't want to close it until we're ready to do our first paycheck of the next month. We know that AR and inventory and order entry all close together, or at least in the order of AR, inventory, and then order entry. And then, of course, accounts payable and cash management run together. So I don't close cash management by itself. I close accounts payable, and then it subsequently closes cash management. And then, of course, our general ledger module. So I do have, as long as I am in the same open month, I can close multiple modules using the company close function all at one time. Now, it will cycle through module by module, but I don't have to go into each individual utility or each individual close menu of the modules and initiate that close. I make one backup, I do a company close, and then I can move forward. So that's a thought for the future. Remember that doing the backups and doing the closings is an exclusive option, which means nobody else should be in the software, especially in that company at the time that you're trying to make the backup and trying to do the close. Of course, here's the talk about backing up our data. We definitely want to remember to make that backup. And again, we talk about the various modules and the order in which we close them. And we've got some of the graphics here that just remind you of some of the things that you might need to take into consideration when you are doing these period end tasks. If you need to print an audit trail for the general ledger, you may or may not do that. If you need to print your statements for your customers, for the payroll here, we find that it is the end of a payroll quarter, so there will be reports and forms that we would need to process in order to move forward. Just as a reiteration here of the order in which we might close modules if we're doing it manually. Payroll, obviously we do that on the monthly basis, sometime between the last payroll of the month and the first payroll of the next month. We'll make a special exception at year end. We want to talk about that briefly, and we'll do that in the second half of the session this afternoon. The accounts payable module. Remember that in accounts payable and accounts receivable, we can look forward 1 month from the current month in which we are working. We can look back 12 months. So you always have to keep those relatively up to date. If you're keeping AR up to date, you're going to keep order entry and inventory control up to date as well. If you're using the job cost module, again, I would just consider closing that at the end of each month. And general ledger, you can leave that open. It's dependent on the settings of whether or not you allow prior month postings. So we want to make sure that our settings are in sync and we've got the right results that we want for the general ledger. General ledger, we can post up to, I believe it's 12 months into the future and 24 months into the past. That is a lot different than the AP and the AR modules because those have a tighter limitation. But we do have a little bit more flexibility with the general ledger, which means we could potentially leave that module open a little bit longer than we do the other modules. So what do? It is the month end, and it's time to start getting all of our things together, month end or year end in particular. Things that we want to consider. We certainly would like to reconcile our bank accounts. We would want to make sure that we have all of our invoices for the month that we are getting ready to close, or especially the year end for the fiscal year end. Make sure that we have all of those transactions entered to the best of our ability. Once we have all those transactions, all those invoices entered, we would probably want to run an AP aging report and keep that as an historical threshold or an historical marker. Once we go into the next year or the next period, it's possible that if we go back and we enter historical transactions, we may or may not be looking at the same information. So I always like recommending get a baseline of where you are pretty much on the last day of the month and hold on to that as a reference point so that if future transactions get entered, or even maybe historical transactions that didn't get entered correctly previously, we at least know where we were at the end of the period, and anything else, it'll become a little easier to chase down and figure out why it is not where we expect it. When we get to the end of the calendar year, and not a fiscal year, this is calendar year, we run our 1099s. So we certainly want to be positioned to have to be able to do that. Talking about printing the 1099s, we've got a way that we can get to that. The 1099s are generated by a third-party application called Atrix, Aatrix. You do need to have a current maintenance plan because Atrix updates will be offered to you pretty significantly at year-end, calendar year-end, because of all the other forms updates that are going on. So you might see that update hit a number of times even within a week or a couple weeks that you're working on this, where throughout the other part of the year you don't necessarily see those things happen. Some rules about what you will print. If you are going to print your forms, you must have the red pre-printed forms, 2-part for the MISC forms, 3-part for the NEC forms, the non-employee compensation forms. The recipient copy may be printed on blank, typically 4-part perforated paper. And then the summary, the 1096 form, that must go on the red 1096 form if you are paper filing with the federal government. You do have the ability to do e-filing, so that eliminates the need for the paper, but there is also a fee for e-filing through Atrix. Let me show you real quick before I move on too fast. If I get into the accounts payable and I go into my vendors and I go to my 1099 processing, of course, the first thing that's going to happen is that I'm going to get the prompt for my updating. And I know, oh, there we go. And I am missing my enhanced reporting. Grab that real quick here. I just changed computers a few days ago and I forgot to put that on this computer. I apologize. Okay. So I go back to my vendors. I go to my 1099 processing and make sure that, there we go. I can do new forms. I can open previously processed forms. And the only 2 form types that BusinessWorks supports are the miscellaneous and the NEC forms. BusinessWorks does not offer the dividend or the interest 1099s. So if you need to process those, you do those outside the system. I can certainly run my 1099s for my existing vendors. I can limit that list however I might see fit. And then BusinessWorks will go out and it will fire up the automatic update. Since this is the first time that I've run this software on this computer, and it could be this time of year that we might see a multitude of updates. I've had a number of situations where I have done the automatic update. I've gone off to a different task. I came back later that same day, and that update was presented to me again. So it's a little entertaining at times. So I'll go through the update. I get a wizard that will walk me through. I just follow the bouncing prompts. And you might see a lot of forms that look like they are related to payroll. If you're not processing payroll, why am I getting these forms? Well, because Atrix works for both payroll and for the vendor 1099s, I may have to watch some of these other forms come through. I don't get to pick and choose what I want to update or what I don't want to update. We just have to take the entire update in order for the software to work correctly. I may never run those payroll forms, that's okay, but I will want my 1099 forms for sure as I'm doing my vendor 1099s. The first time the update hits, or if you haven't done an update for quite some time, it will take a couple of moments. If you're doing the updates pretty regularly, it's the same computer that's doing the forms all the time. The updates won't take quite so long. How do I know if I have my vendor information set up correctly? I don't really have that in the slides, but I do want to approach that. If you're not familiar with setting up your vendors for 1099s, we pull up a vendor and we go to the Other tab. And right here at the top, we see the federal ID number and we see which box, which form. The NEC box is only box 1, that is the non-employee compensation. We look at the miscellaneous boxes. Box 1 is typically rent, box 3 is other income, box 14 is for your attorneys. So you will need to make sure that they are set up. It does not matter whether or not the attorneys are incorporated. All attorney firms get 1099s. Otherwise, you look at your recipient. If your recipient is an incorporated entity, you don't have to issue a 1099 to them. If it is a sole proprietorship or a partnership, then yes, you would want to issue a 1099 to that entity so that they can report that with their tax return. Still got a little bit chunking along here. I'll reserve the payroll side of it for a little bit later, and we won't have to go through this fun of updating, hopefully, because this will be the update for today. While I'm waiting on that, how many of you have e-filed forms through Atrix? Excellent. In order to do the e-filing with Atrix, you will have to be registered with Atrix. It's an easy thing to do. It's just basically signing up on their website, setting up your federal ID number, and identifying the jurisdictions in which you might need to file forms. That will become more important on the payroll side, but for the federal, for the 1099s, should be fairly straightforward. Once you have all of that, then you can work through the e-filing aspect of it. And they actually take credit card right there at the time of the processing so that you can pay for the transmission without having to take care of it a different way. So we've got the forms updated, and then basically BusinessWorks and Atrix will go out and we'll look at the various vendors in this case and identify what payments were submitted to those vendors and help prepare. As long as those vendors are set up correctly in the vendor maintenance, we can certainly process those forms. Now, my data is 2022, but I am going to be getting a 2023 form and walking through the wizard. I can do a test drive. I typically don't recommend that. It goes through and it will process for watermarked forms that you cannot submit. And you wouldn't, if you get it all done and you get to the point at the very end where you think you're ready to e-file, it's not going to let you e-file. The wonderful thing is I can always come back in. I can start my processing. I can save my status, and then I can go ahead and come back into it if I'm not ready to finish my filing. Confirm my taxpayer ID number. If I'm using multiple BusinessWorks company files that all run under the same federal ID number, I could potentially pull information from all of those different companies, combining them into one 1099 submission. Most of us, however, just have a single company and run the 1099s for that particular company. And then we can go ahead and make sure that we have our own company information in, and whatever our address information is, our city, state, zip, and it wants a contact name. I can fill that in however I need to. I can have an email. And this is a little pickier than it has been in years past, where I've been able to skip past a lot of those things. So this becomes a little bit more informative. Typically, I'm going to file for my own company, my own employer. And any tax items here, if I'm running payroll also, I might see my tax jurisdictions, and it might bark at me to have an appropriately formatted tax number. You can go ahead and fill that in, but in reality, it's not necessary for the 1099s unless your state has to report to your jurisdiction for the 1099s. I'm from Indiana. Indiana does not have to file a state version of the 1099. It just files the federal version. So I may be able to get away with not having any tax items here. I can opt to allow recipients to receive 1099s electronically. And how do I want to show the recipient ID number? And then on whether or not, what do I do when there's zeros? So if I don't have a valid ID number, BusinessWorks and Atrix are going to try to populate as zeros. If I have a valid ID number on the recipient forms, do I want them to see their full number? Do I want to see it masked with stars or with X's? Just as a suggestion, I would say on the recipient copies, I would not truncate it. I would not mask it. And the reason is if one of the first few digits is incorrect, they would not know it if we mask it. So I would be inclined for the recipient copy to see the full ID number just to make sure that it is correct. And then we go ahead and we start the processing, and BusinessWorks at Atrix will then open up a listing here. Now, my test company doesn't have any 1099 vendors, but what we would see would be the list of the recipients, their ID numbers, whether or not they are a company or they are an individual. So if the taxpayer ID number is a social security number, this checkbox would be empty. If they've got a DBA name or a company name, and then we can confirm address information. All of the static information that goes at the top of the 1099, we see that on the left-hand side of this grid. And as we go through it and we step, Atrix will go off and it will find out any anomalies. And it might prompt us to say, hey, wait a minute, this address is not a valid address. The way it's spelled, or there's invalid characters. Might do the same thing for the names. So there are some things that Atrix will do to help make sure that we format these forms as correctly as possible. And then on the right-hand side, we see the various box numbers. Now, I had chosen the 1099 miscellaneous form, so I have a whole bunch of box numbers here. And those box numbers will have the various totals of the forms and for each payee, and then a grand total, so we know what the 1096 might look like. And then we walk that through. We get an opportunity to correct as we need to. We get a chance to print or preview our forms so that we know what they're going to look like. And then when we're ready, we get an opportunity to either print to the pre-printed copies or to e-file and submit those electronically. So that was a pretty healthy rundown on the 1099s and some things that we do for the year end. Let's talk a little bit about accounts receivable. Again, first thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that our data entry is all posted for the current period. Being really careful about the difference between posting receipts and doing the bank deposits. That seems to be where people get bit most often. They might date a receipt from a customer December 31st, and then they don't create the bank deposit until January 2nd. And it turns out that um, your general ledger will not jive with your bank reconciliation because you've got details in your bank that aren't in your bank reconciliation. So especially at month end, it's really, really critical to watch how we date our transactions and make sure that we're dating them correctly. If we are doing finance charges, we want to apply our finance charges. And if we're printing our customer statements, we certainly want to make sure that we get those printed out. And you want to make sure that you reconcile your aging to your balance sheet. And really what that means is run that aging report as of the end of the month and take a look at your balance sheet for that same month. If we've had that situation where, I'm sorry, back up a half a second here. It's possible where we might have some anomaly where our transactions aren't jiving with our general ledger. Maybe somebody posted a general journal entry to our accounts receivable account. We want to make sure that we catch that and take care of that so that we don't run our system with disparate information. Inventory, that's another fun section that we can work in if we are processing inventory. Basically, before you move into future periods, you would want to consider doing your physical count. Some people do a count every month, some people do a count once a year, some people never do a count. And they just do manual adjustments throughout the course of the year. If you're going to do the physical count, you have to lock your inventory. And once you lock your inventory, nobody can transact on any inventory items until that inventory gets updated and unlocked. So the concept basically is sometimes people call it freezing the inventory, locking the inventory. Get your count sheets, enter those, get those updated, and then the stock status report is probably the best report to use to tie your existing inventory to your balance sheet. This is probably the worst area for keeping reconciled because it's so easy to have strange things happen in inventory. But if you use that stock status report and you compare that to your balance sheet basically every month, you should be able to stay in balance and effectively prove out the numbers on your financial statements. Once you have everything adjusted and corrected, you can come back through and unlock that inventory, and then you would be able to move on for processing orders, purchase orders, sales order, invoices, and so on. And then finally, our friend, the general ledger. Basically, this is the last house on the street. You want to make sure all of your other modules have been reconciled and closed appropriately before you consider closing the general ledger. If you are using recurring journals, you would want to go ahead and print and post those. And then, of course, any final year-end adjustments that you need to do, maybe depreciation entries. Your accountant needs to review your financial statements and they would make any other adjustments. You would go ahead and get those into the December timeframe and then go ahead and finish the closing of the books. One of the things in BusinessWorks is that once you close a module, we cannot reopen it. So you want to either make sure you have that backup handy or you are comfortable with the position that you are in so that you can go ahead and get the modules closed appropriately. What happens when we close our general ledger for the year end? Basically, your net income or your net loss gets summarized into your retained earnings account, and the number of your profit and loss accounts, your P&L accounts, get zeroed out to start the new fiscal year. Your balance sheet accounts hang around because those are your statements of position. Where am I at any point in time? The P&L is basically what's the activity that happened during a certain time frame. And then, of course, based on the number of years to retain transaction history and summary history, once that oldest period drops off, then the beginning balances for new periods get recalculated, and those become our technical starting points for the data in the software. All right, I have rambled quite a bit here so far. Do we have anybody that has any questions? I don't see any that have been chatted thus far in the questions chat box. Everybody seemed fairly comfortable with the concept of what we need to do at year end. Again, I am Mary Hildinger, mhildinger@dwdtechgroup.com. You can call our local Fort Wayne number, 423-2414, or call our toll-free number. If you have any questions about BusinessWorks and you would like a little bit of assistance, please feel free to reach out. And I will get back with you as quickly as I possibly can. For those of you who are sticking around for the payroll, we are going to take a short break. Probably, let's say, top of the hour. Let's come back and we will walk through some of the concepts in payroll. And from there, then let you folks have your day back. All right, welcome back, everybody. For those of you who are just joining, not having been at the first session, welcome. For those of you who have been here and took that break with me, we're going to cover payroll specifics for the year end. And again, if you have already been through the first part of the webinar, we're familiar with how to submit questions. And if you have any questions along the way, feel free to edit or type those into the questions box. And if nothing else, I will at least get a record of the question and I'll be able to get an answer to you after the session. We're going to do a quick welcome again, probably basically, I don't think anybody has changed, so I'll go through that very quickly. I am Mary Hildinger, and we will talk about the payroll aspect. We're going to recover the supported versions. We talked about that in the first session. Again, as a reminder, only 2 versions that are being supported by Sage these days. And right now it's version 2023 and version 2021. So make sure that you get updated so that your software will continue to be compatible and run with the appropriate information that the software offers. So what do we do? Well, just like we talked about in the first session, we would want to maybe make a backup. And anytime that we make a backup, we want to, or before we close the month, we want to make a backup. In our history settings, especially at year end, if we have a terminated employee, somebody who's no longer going to work for us and they were terminated maybe earlier in the year, there is history that may be hung on to, may be kept, unless you choose to delete them. So we want to watch how that behaves. Again, at year's end, it is recommended that we archive the company prior to printing the W-2s. And then certainly we would want to make sure that we've got the Atrix updates so that we can grab the forms for the year that we want. Now, one thing that may or may not be real obvious is that the tax table updates, the thing that comes at the end of the year, um, we typically don't want to install that until after we have run our 1099, or I'm sorry, our W-2s. The reason being is that the tax tables are global. That means that it doesn't matter whether it's an historical company or it is our live company. If we have changes to the W-2s thresholds, especially the Social Security threshold, and I put that new tax table in before I run my W-2s, I may have some issues with my W-2s tying out correctly. So we certainly want to watch for that and make sure that we do get our forms run before we apply the new tax table update. And that might mean we don't apply the tax table update till the end of the January timeframe. That's generally an okay thing. There are ways we can get around that manually. If we decide we want to go ahead and apply the update, we can manually adjust the Social Security wage threshold, run our W-2s, but we just have to remember to put the wage threshold back. What is in the tax table update, typically federal and state wage limits and tax tables. If you have local jurisdictions, you know that those are not included in the tax tables, and you need to go ahead and update those rates manually. In order to do our forms, again, we talked about the having Atrix, or what we call the enhanced tax filing and reporting. So if I get into the payroll, let me get to a company that has payroll. And if what I got hit with when I tried to run the 1099s, if you were in the earlier session, I didn't have the enhanced tax reporting and e-filing installed yet. So we will know right away whether or not it's installed. In this case, it is installed for me because it did pop me right into the payroll tax filing and reporting. And in our payroll reporting, we can do our federal reporting. We get a list of all of our federal forms. If you have not gotten into this for some time, you might notice, well, and especially here when we're going to do our W-2s, where's the 2023 W-2 form? It will come. It will come by way of running the Atrix update. And because we did the Atrix update with the payables and the 1099, and I still don't see the 2023 W-2 here, I'm pretty sure that it's not out yet. I would expect it about any time. Usually those updates come out mid-December, so we're still maybe a day or two early. And if I do try to run it and I don't get an update, I'll just get a message from the software that says, hey, the form that you're trying to run doesn't correspond to the year of the payroll that you're trying to run. At least we can do a spot check and see what is there, and then maybe do some preliminary reconciliations on those forms. Once we get through that part of it, of course, then, excuse me, we have other forms that we can run, obviously our 941s, our 940 at year end, that is the federal unemployment form. Of course, we have our state forms. I'm from Indiana, so I'm most familiar with them. But if you have your own jurisdictions, you would get whatever appropriate forms that might be out there. Just as a side note for Indiana, we have some different rules. The local copies for some of the state forms, there are different thresholds for the number of employees for e-filing. In talking about the forms, the Form 940 and the Form 941, you can still paper file those. That's okay. The W-2s, you do not have to have pre-printed forms for either the federal copies or the employee copies or the state copies, if you can still file on paper. Excuse me. Normally, if you hit a certain threshold of employees, you are required to e-file. And of course, some state tax forms. Again, I can speak to Indiana. I cannot speak to other jurisdictions, but the state unemployment form, we actually cannot file a paper copy of that. There is a website through which we go, or we have to have Atrix e-file it for us, where we report the unemployment wages and the unemployment tax calculation. With regard to the W-2s, even though, yes, we can print them on plain paper, we are required to provide instructions. You can order those pre-print or those perforated pre-printed instruction forms from Sage Software or from a variety of other forms providers. I've got other sources if you do not want to order directly from Sage. If you do e-file, you can go through Atrix to take care of that. They will charge you whatever their respective fees are. They'll even print and mail your employees' W-2s for you if you choose. So you could go completely paperless and let Atrix do everything, or you can do a variety of options, kind of like an a la carte menu. Now, I talked about the limits of employees. For the employees in Indiana, if this rule has changed, and I believe it changed just this year, if you have 10 or more returns that need to be filed, doesn't matter whether they're currently employed or not, but at least 10, you must e-file your state copy. That threshold used to be 25. The federal threshold's 250. You could potentially mail the government 250 W-2s if you so choose. But if you would prefer to e-file, it's probably more efficient, it is quicker, and it is probably safer in the long run. If you live outside Indiana, I would suggest you consult your accountant, your CPA, and make sure that you are following your state's particular requirements. And that goes for state and any potential local copies that might need to get filed as well. As I mentioned, the updates should be available sometime this month. And if you have an account with Sage as far as their knowledge base, their customer portal, you can certainly check for the updates, find out when the tax tables will be available. But as a reminder, you probably do not want to apply that until you have processed all your W-2s and have completed all of your year-end reporting. But here's the trick. I've got to close payroll so that I can print checks in January. Well, yes, that does not mean that I can't do that. I can't, I don't have to stop my world to finish my payroll tax forms at the end of the year. The cool thing with the Atrix functionality that used to not exist is that we can go back and look at a prior period. So I might go ahead and get my payroll closed into January. I probably ought to have a backup. So that's going to be a good thing too. And when I go in to run my forms, and let's say I'm going to run my 941 form, I just pick the year and I make sure I pick the correct quarter for which I am reporting. Now, my sample data only has 2020 and 2019, so I could go back to the last year and I still have that information. So I can continue to process my payroll in the new year. I just won't have the updated tax tables yet, but by the end of January, all of my tax reporting should be done. I can go ahead and get those tax tables applied. But in the meantime, I can work with the historical data from the prior year just by watching what year and what quarter I am choosing to report. As I showed you earlier when we ran the forms, we did walk through of an account verification, and we might see this automatic update. This is the time of the year that it's going to hit a multitude of times before it settles down by mid to end of January. Just do the automatic update, please. Makes it a lot easier. It gets you the software that you need. Make sure that your forms are as up to date as possible. One point of note, and I've had this come up a couple of times over this past year. I've had clients ask me about being able to reproduce or to reprocess a prior year's W-2 or a prior year's 941. I cannot generate on a form for, let's say, 2021 if my 941 forms are already dated 2023. So if I've done one and I've created it in history, that's one thing, because that form got saved with that process. If I have to create a new one because it never got created in the first place, Atrix will not give me that form for that specific time frame. That's going to be something I'm going to have to get a paper copy and file it by hand or contact the IRS or whatever the jurisdiction is to get an appropriate form or be directed to where a form can be processed. So I can get the data from that historical period, but I can't get the exact form once I have updated Atrix for whatever forms update, especially into a new year. So just a little side note, it's not necessarily the end of the world, but in general, we do want to do the automatic update whenever it is offered to us. Otherwise, we will get watermarked forms, and those certainly cannot get submitted to the governmental organization. When you're doing the updates, I know a lot of my clients are getting pretty tight with their internet security and their network security because of so many hacking attacks, ransomware, stuff like that. If you're having problems or you get errors when you try to run the automatic update, you might have your IT people allow the atrix.com to the trusted websites. You might also need to modify the privacy tab and allow these specific sites that are listed. You will get a copy of this handout, and you will get a copy of the recording. So as a note, if you miss something, we'll cover, it'll be covered there. The other thing that you might have to consider or have your IT consider are firewall settings. And you might need to make sure that the http://updates.atrix.com is allowed and HTTP port 80 is allowed. So those are firewall settings that your IT people can help you set up. I have done a little bit of that. I am not real crazy about doing that. I would rather have your IT do it because they are going to be more in tune with the actual network settings. So You are welcome to ask me, but I may defer it to your IT just because I want to make sure that it's done correctly. The other thing that I want to share with you is the customer portal. If you do not have yourself set up as an authorized contact for your organization, you would want to do that. Consider doing that. There's a form that you might have to fill out. If you don't get set up as an authorized contact, you can't create credentials to get access to the knowledge base. And that is as close to the front line of talking to Sage as going through Sage's live chat, because that knowledge base is effectively the same knowledge base that they use. So it's the knowledge base that we use when you call us. It's basically the same knowledge base that Sage support uses when you call them. You have access to that as well as part of your client care plan. So I would encourage you to get set up with the customer portal. You can go find your downloads there. You can find the product updates. Lots of good information out there. You also get access to what's called Sage City. That is another forum where Sage technical support people hang out, other resellers hang out, other users just like you folks hang out, and we share information. You know, if somebody's got a question, it's usually the same day that somebody reaches back out, whether it's a Sage tech support person or somebody else, offering an answer. So it's another way to culminate information from a lot of different sources and get as good an answer as is available. I know I didn't have a whole lot on the payroll side. It is a little bit shorter topic than is on the rest of the software, but I can open it up for questions. Again, I do not see any questions that were entered in the chat area. If you have questions, we can go ahead and just have you raise your hand and I can unmute you and we can continue with that. And if we don't have any questions, I want to thank you so much for coming along and hanging out with us here this afternoon. All right, if there aren't any questions, we will get you copies. If you don't already have copies of the presentation, we will get you a copy of the presentation and we will get you a copy of the recording of this presentation today. So you are welcome to view it at your leisure. Thank you all so very much for being here today.